The Hand of Fear in many ways feels like quite an average story for Doctor Who, but it is brought to life and made a rather memorable one with the introduction of certain elements, the presentation of the material, and of course our main cast. This serial is paced out pretty well. We get our introduction and setup to what's going on, but it honestly takes a good bit before you really know where the story is going. Some serials you can pretty easily tell what is going to happen within the first few minutes of the setup, but this one does a really good job of keeping you guessing to an extent. It's not entirely clear which direction it's headed in, which helps to keep the serial that much more engaging. The opening that we get is interesting because it kind of sets the stage for the rest of the serial, but it's information that doesn't completely pay off for quite a bit. It's not quite that it's clunkily set up, but because there's not a lot of interesting stuff happening, it does feel like a little hiccup in the pacing and the flow of the story right out of the gate. But it does quite immediately pick up as soon as our main TARDIS duo arrives on screen, and they quite readily get wrapped up in the events of this story as they unfold. I'm going to have a little bit of a spoiler light section here where I'll talk about some things that happened in part 1. I don't consider them to be proper spoilers, but if you really do want to go into this thing blind, which is probably the best way to go into it if you have not seen this one, then you might want to skip to the time as shown on screen. But if you don't mind knowing the setup for the story and what happens in the first part, then let's continue. I do like our first introduction to the titular Hand of Fear, coming after Sarah Jane and the Doctor very nearly get crushed by a bunch of rocks. And yeah, Sarah Jane would have died here, but just be thankful she didn't. Sarah Jane reaches out from where she is trapped, grabbing onto this stone hand with a ring on it. How exactly this hand got here, what exactly its whole deal is, we don't yet know. I like how we are introduced to this kind of odd thing, and then as we get further into the story, we see what its deal is as information is gradually fed to us throughout the serial. One of the more interesting ways this manifests is in the possession of Sarah Jane by the Hand. We did just see her hypnotized in the Mask of Mandragora, but in this one it's handled so much better because the story doesn't actually tell us what she's doing and what precisely her goal is. This enables the scenes of her being motivated by the Hand to be really quite engaging, with her repeating the words,
"Eldrad must live,"
and wandering around in a rather eerie fashion. I love the way the scenes of her being possessed as she goes towards the nuclear reactor are shot. They just really add to the unnatural quality of her possession. Everything going on with the Hand and Sarah Jane in the first part serve as the main thread that keep me quite interested, which carries to an extent into the second part of the story, though this is when her possession does come to an end. And I did quite like everything going on with that. I am ultimately quite glad that it was involved in the progression of the story, but also ended rather early on so as to allow us to have a good deal of time with our main duo together, which is something I really valued in this one and I will touch on again before long. Okay, here is the main spoiler warning. I know it's early in the review, but there's just so much in this one that if you haven't seen it, it's better to go in blind, and I'd like to actually discuss it and get into it. So here is your last chance to avoid spoilers by skipping to the time as shown on screen, and for everybody else, let's continue. As I mentioned before, we do get this build-up with the Hand, which is in fact able to regenerate into a fully formed Eldrad, and I do like the design and concept of a silicone-based life form, and I appreciate how the species is quite different to humans. Eldrad is able to use radiation to regenerate their body, it's just cool in concept and execution, and as a foe, Eldrad works rather well. They're honestly very interesting in the beginning when they are using others to help them replenish their body, which is probably the most interesting aspect, but also when their form is this fully formed person. The position that this character is in is kind of interesting, because although they are causing some degree of harm to the planet, it seems that their intentions aren't actually all that bad. Their main goal is to get back to their planet. So as our characters go into the final part, it does seem that the Doctor will be able to resolve this without too much conflict, which is somewhat true and also not. And while I was interested by the position the characters found themselves in parts 3 and even 4, it is honestly just a tad less interesting than what we got in the first couple of parts. I think this more ominous threat would be a bit better for me than the physical form of the character, which did leave a little bit more to be desired, but was still ultimately pretty effective. The way the story is resolved is rather interesting because it starts with the goal of saving Eldrad's life as they have been effectively poisoned with an acid, and this carries through a pretty good portion of part 4, with these characters making their way to the regenerator chamber. It was surprisingly entertaining given that they were spending a few minutes getting from point A to point B, but I think it helped that there were these sort of traps along the way to keep it interesting. The part that I actually mostly quite liked was the way that Eldrad discovered that Rokon had actually been dead for a very long time.
The Castrian race chose final oblivion. Traitor! I gave their lives! So now you are king, as was your wish. I salute you from the dead. Hail Eldrad, king of nothing.
What a great line. You can tell how pissed off Eldrad gets at this as they find out that he's just ruling over the ashes. There is nothing left for him. Even though the conflict between Rokon and Eldrad wasn't really established until this part, I couldn't help but find it to be a rather engaging and a pretty fitting conclusion for Eldrad. Well, he does actually trip over the doctor's scarf and fall into the abyss, which isn't the most interesting of ways to go, but I suppose it didn't really need to be. In the end, it didn't really bother me, even though it was presented in a little bit of a silly way. And of course, the primary thing I need to discuss from this story is the exit of Elizabeth Sladen as the character of Sarah Jane. I knew this was coming, and it was something I was very much not looking forward to because, as I have reiterated countless times, she is a wonderful companion and she is absolutely incredible with Tom Baker as the Doctor. I have become so enamored with their era over the past couple of seasons that I really was just dreading her departure because it's the rare thing that sometimes happens to me where I just get so attached to a specific show or character that to see this kind of change, well, losing this character felt like losing the show in a way. Because that's how attached I had become to her, the Doctor, and their utterly incredible chemistry throughout their entire time on the show. And in this story, during the time Sarah Jane wasn't possessed, they were still so delightful together. Throughout the first couple of parts, when her body was taken control of by the alien, she kept repeating the words,
"Eldrad must live."
So the Doctor puts her into a trance, which, by the way, I can't remember if that's something the Doctor has done before. I tend to lose track of these things. And he just finishes removing Eldrad's influence on her as they head off to the control room, which is when this happens.
There's no need to obey the will of Eldrad. Put him out of your mind. You're free of him.
I'm free of him.
Yes. Come.
Eldrad must live.
What?
Just testing.
No joy from Driscoll, I'm afraid.
It's such a lovely and simple moment between the two, and apparently that was actually an ad-lib by Elizabeth Sladen as a bit of a prank on Tom Baker, which is quite interesting. I say apparently because the only place I personally was able to find this information was on IMDb and TV Tropes, and I don't know how reliable either of those are, especially the latter of the two, so maybe take that with a grain of salt in case it's not true, though I certainly hope it is. And one of the things Sarah always does, which I love, is that fairly frequently the Doctor will tell her to wait somewhere, and she will for the slightest amount of time before she does ultimately run after him. It's not like she's being an idiot, she just wants to be with him, and like she says,
I worry about you. Anyway, who found that thing?
You did.
Right. So, I'm involved. It could have been me, not Driscoll. And besides, I'm from Earth and you're not.
That's true.
Exactly.
Yes, but
But what?
I worry about you.
So, be careful.
We'll both be careful.
Right.
it's just another nice little moment between these two friends, and I am so glad Sarah Jane is a companion who doesn't always listen to the Doctor, because it would be much less entertaining if it was just the Doctor going around without Sarah Jane for the entire story. Needless to say, her leaving felt like a dagger in the heart. Knowing what was coming and being unable to stop it from happening, it was just incredibly devastating and brought me to absolute tears. in a way that no other companion exit really has, at least in the classic series. I think that just about any way this could have been handled would have made me incredibly sad no matter what, even if they hugged and were terribly nice to each other right at the end, which they aren't entirely. It's so heartbreaking knowing that this is the last time these two will ever see each other, at least with this incarnation of the Doctor, the incarnation that Sarah Jane has traveled with for so long. And the way that they chose to end these two characters' journey together was so tough because at the end of this story, Sarah Jane is just venting at the Doctor, and you can see that she is very definitely frustrated.
I just want to feel human again.
Forget the Zeus plug. I'll have the sonic screwdriver.
Oh, and boy, am I sick of that sonic screwdriver. Oh. I'm going to pack my goodies and I'm going home. I said, I'm going to pack my goodies and I am going home. Right. Excuse me.
But when the Doctor tells her that she has to go because he's been called to Gallifrey, she reveals that she actually does not want to leave. Sarah Jane had gotten quite frustrated, but that doesn't mean that she wants to stop traveling with him.
I can't miss Gallifrey. Look, I was only joking. I didn't mean it. Hey, you're not going to regenerate again, are you?
Not this time. I don't know what's going to happen.
You're playing one of your jokes on me, just trying to make me stay.
No. I've received a call, and as a Time Lord, I must obey.
Alone?
Yes.
This is really a very unique companion departure in Doctor Who, because while there have been quite sad exits before, the ones that come to mind for me are Jamie, Zoe, and Jo, this one is handled quite differently. Where with Jamie and Zoe they forgot about the Doctor, and with Jo she moved on with her life and left him, this feels like a tragic twist on the kinds of companion departures that Classic Who has been quite familiar with, and those are the ones that just kind of happen. While Sarah Jane had been trying to go home for a good bit of season 13, and also having these adventures along the way, it's clearly gotten to the point where she's not trying to get back home anymore. But by the circumstances of the situation, she does end up leaving the Doctor when she arrives back home. It just sort of happens. She explicitly says she didn't mean it, she didn't want to go, but the Doctor leaves her on Earth anyways, as he is not allowed to take her to Gallifrey. This is the first time we see the Doctor tell a companion, hey, I am done traveling with you, and it was actually true. In this story, we see the Doctor leave his best friend behind and move on, and it is utterly heartbreaking because these two are such close friends, and because they do care for each other so much.
Don't forget me.
Sarah, don't you forget me.
Bye, Doctor.
Bye.
You know, travel does broaden the mind.
Yes. Till we meet again, Sarah.
It's so unbelievably crushing to see the last of these two together in this era, and this was the first time that the exit of a companion really made me cry. The two departures I already mentioned were quite sad, but neither of them got me as much as Sarah Jane leaving the TARDIS, because this killed me. Unsurprisingly, I am going to miss Sarah Jane an awful lot. In fact, I am definitely going to miss her more than any other companion we've had in Classic Who so far, and I wish she had stayed on longer in the show, but I did find her exit to be an incredibly emotional one, and it was certainly the defining moment of what was otherwise quite a solid story, as the ending minutes were just fantastic and did elevate this into a serial I won't be forgetting anytime soon. Overall, this was a really solid story with a lot to love. It progresses at a steady pace while constantly introducing new elements and playing with them in really interesting and engaging ways. The Doctor and Sarah Jane are highlights as always, with more great moments in here and an irresistible amount of chemistry. This serial had a strong concept executed rather well, with the whole piece being added to by its unbelievably emotional final scene. This was a really good story, and I'm going to give The Hand of Fear a rating of 8.5 out of 10. And that does it for today's story. I had quite a lot of fun with this one up until the very end, where it of course made me want to crawl into a hole and never come out. Whatever your thoughts are, be sure to leave them down below. I am very curious as to what you all have to say. I hope to see you around this upcoming Sunday for a review of The Deadly Assassin, a wholly different story which I look forward to discussing with you. But if not, that is totally cool. Just know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, thank you very much for watching. Take care, and have a lovely week.